afternoon session. This is a special workshop, and it will run for 1 hour and a half. We will finish around 3 o'clock. And we have the honor of Mary Pythoniak from ETS USA to talk about us about fundamentals in standard settings.
Now, we in standard setting have a lot of words to say. Thank you. Or if it's a student, if it's a parent of a student, they'll say, well, does a 215 get my child into the next grade or class, or does it not? So we want these levels of performance to distinguish between people, to give more meaning to our score scale than just a number. So we want a test score to make a decision rule, either pass, don't pass. On the National Assessment of Educational Progress on which I work, we have below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. So we're changing our continuous distribution into levels. So a lot of examples of decisions, like I've said, are pass, fail. If you were applying for a certificate to be a teacher and you took a teacher test, you would pass or you would fail. That's what the people making the decision want to know, pass or fail. Qualified or unqualified, award a diploma, don't award a diploma and you don't graduate, grant a professional license or certification, do not grant, and like I said, students into categories such as below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. So if we had a pass-fail test, we have our 0 to 100% on the test, and it is our judgments, well, not our judgments, but our panelist judgments who decide where this goes. There is no absolute right or wrong where it goes, but it's the outcome of a process that decides where we're going to put this score on the 0 to 100% scale. Or on NAEP, the American National Survey Assessment in grade 4 mathematics, it's a scale from 0 to 500, but the scores that divide the levels are 214, 249, and 282. So there are two kinds of standards, relative and absolute. And in different countries across the world, you may be using one or another or a combination of these kinds of standards. So if it's a relative standard, you're compared, if you're taking the test, you're compared to other people who took the test. So if your score is in the top % of the group, then it's good enough. So if we all take the test, the top 10% of us are going to pass. Or in the second example, if your score is above the average score, so if we all take the test and we have an average score and I'm above it, I'm going to pass, and if you're below it, you're not going to pass. So good enough is defined by how we all do on the test. Now, absolute standards don't depend on how we all do. They are designed to pass those of us who have a minimum level of knowledge, skills, or abilities. They don't depend on how we all do. So those of us who answer 60% of the questions would be good enough, or if we got 55 points out of the 75 points, we would be good enough. So here is just a graphic to describe that for a criterion reference cut score that I just described, where it doesn't matter how you do versus me, it matters how much we know. So if those of us in the room, let me see if I can, in this example, we have a score scale of 0 to 200. And let's say that we have our cut score is 120. Now, if we have a group of examinees that are not that high in ability. They don't know a lot about the subject. With our cut score of 120, we're not going to pass a lot of people. It's because we're going by what they know, not by the distribution of scores. If we happen to have a very able group of students, we would have, it's so distracting, we would have more people passing the test. So this is the part that stays the same, the cut score, and the distribution of scores is what it is, okay? So we have the same amount of content, this 120 mastered, but we may have a lot of people pass or we may have few people pass. It depends on their ability level. Okay. Now, a relative or norm reference cut score is based on how they do on the test, but you can't say with certainty how much they know because you are just comparing people and how they do. So here, we might decide we want 60% of the people to pass because that's how many slots we have in our program, in our university. So we decide on our cut score based on how many people will pass. So if we have a less able group, yes. Oh, thank you. If we have a less able group, it will be a lower score, and if we have a more able group, it will be a higher score. So there are advantages and disadvantages of both kinds of cut scores, and you may use the different types in your countries. With the absolute cut score, you know that if we all take the test and we have an absolute cut score, that we all have a certain knowledge of skill and ability. But we don't know ahead of time how many people will pass the test. In a relative cut score, I know how many people are going to pass because I decided that in advance. But I don't know how much they know. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each type. For the relative standards, if I am the director of an agency, my agency makes a decision. I may say the top 30% are going to pass this test, and that is a decision that I make with my agency. For the absolute standards, we do a study. There are several ways to do this, as I will describe, but we do a study to determine how much knowledge and skills we think people should have to pass the test. Now, in this workshop, we're going to discuss absolute standards because here, that is a judgment of an agency, depending maybe on how many slots they have in their program. So we don't really need to discuss that. So we're going to discuss how you set absolute standards. So is the distinction between the two types clear? And do you know in your country which you do? Okay. So just out of curiosity, which of you use relative cut scores? Do any of you use a cut score that's based on how people do, not on what they know? No? Yes? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. So, bad methods for setting cut scores. I say It's always been 75 because that's how it's always been, and that's what it is. In my opinion, and this is all opinion, and this is based on what we do, that is not a good enough reason for it to be a 75. Because you can't explain to anyone why it's 75, other than tradition. Cut score is 80 because I say so. If I'm the head of the government agency and I say it's 80, it's 80. Again, I don't know if that's a good idea because you're not basing it on any evidence other than that I say so. Popular numbers, such as 67, 75%, 80, regardless of how hard the test is or what the test is designed to do, that's not a good idea to just make up a number. Now, good methods are those in which we have procedures that are set out ahead of time and we follow them. Okay, that can be scary to people because they don't have control of the process. But as you'll see, at the end, the agency always has the power to adjust it. But what we want is a number that comes from deliberations and consideration of what people can do. We need to be able to explain to people. Now, you know, in the United States, if a parent came and said, "Why did my student not pass the test?" and I said, "Well, I decided that if you didn't know 80%, then you didn't pass." In the United States, that would not go over very well. So you'd have to explain that a little better. And you need to document in your technical report, which hopefully you have for your tests, how you arrived at this decision. And if we do a study like the one that I'll describe, you will be able to document that. So the one thing, if you came to this workshop wanting to know a psychometric formula for finding a cut score, you'll be very disappointed because there is no one correct number for a cut score. It is a judgment on what people need to know and do. There is no psychometric formula for that. So it is a values and expectations about what people should do on the test. It's a judgment. They may be informed by data about what people can do on the test, but it is a judgment-based decision. Now, sometimes, you know, people say, especially if you have people gathered for a standard setting study, they'll say, you know, I don't feel comfortable doing this. And I always say, in the United States, think of a jury, you know, where you have a group of 12 people who make a decision about very important issues, such as whether someone is guilty of a crime. And you depend on the wisdom of the group of reviewing the evidence to make that decision. And this is a very similar process because in a court case, you give them the evidence, the testimony, you know, of all the people participating, and then they discuss and they make a decision. And generally, we go along with that decision. So a standard setting study is the same thing. In general, we get a group of experts together, we give them evidence and information, and we depend on their judgment to be our outcome. So just to distinguish between measurement and cut scores, if we ask in measurement, how tall is the police officer? We can measure the police officer with not a ruler, but you know, a ruler. And if we all measure the police officer, we will come within the same distance with a small standard error, but we will, in general, all have the same measurement of how tall he or she is. But cut scores, such as what is the minimum height for a police officer, is a judgment. Now, years ago in the United States, if you were a short person, if you were a woman who would happen to be shorter, someone decided you are not tall enough to be a police officer. That was just a judgment. But then as time passed and lawsuits happened and people became more flexible, people decided shorter people can be police officers. It's not about brute strength, it's about judgment in critical situations, it's about reasoning. So they changed the height requirement for police officers because they decided you don't need to be as tall. So this really is just showing you that when we do measurement, there is a true height. But when we do a cut score, it's a judgment. That's the purpose of that example. Now, when we make a cut score, because it's a judgment and we do not know who really should pass and who should fail, because if we did, we wouldn't need to do a study, we would already know. But if we were God and we knew who should pass and who should fail, some people who should pass will fail, which is a false negative. So if we do set a cut score, and those of us in the room, a few of us who really do know enough will fail. And some people who should fail will pass. And if we raise or lower the cut score to reduce one type of error, the other error will increase. So let's say that we do know we are God, and we know that these people in the red really should fail the test, and these people here should pass. Now, there's a distribution of people in each case because there are errors of measurement. Somebody might have been tired when they took the test. Someone might have, by luck, known the answers to a certain group of questions, but if they took another test in a week, they wouldn't know. So we have two distributions here. So if we knew for sure who truly should pass and who truly should fail, where would we put the cut score? So we could decide to put it here because we want to equalize who is a false positive and who is a false negative. But we could also decide that we don't want anyone to pass who could possibly not know enough. So let's say this was a test for a surgeon, a very critical type of surgery where people could die easily if the person made a mistake. So we decide we don't want any of these people who could possibly not know enough to be a surgeon. But what happens is all of these people here who really do know enough are also going to fail. So there's no way around that, depending on what type of error we want to make. Now, if we decided, when this might be reasonable is, like I said, a surgeon. Now, what if we decide we have a test for our class 5 students, and we decide we don't want to fail anyone who could pass because that would be mean and that would stigmatize them, and we don't want to hold a student back. We might say, we are going to set the cut score here so that none of these people who could pass will fail. But there are a lot of people who will pass that really shouldn't pass. Okay, so the whole point of this is just you have to decide which type of error is more acceptable to you, and take that into account, because measurement is not infallible, you will make an error of classification, so you need to decide which type is more acceptable. Now, like I said, there is no true cut score out there in the universe ready to be discovered. So there are many ways to set cut scores. If you had a different expert up here, they might have one opinion of what the best way is to set them. And if another one came in the room, they might have a different way. There's a lot of ways to do the methods. Even for a given method, there's different ways of doing it. And no matter what you do, people can say you did it wrong. That's just like any trial, like I said, a jury, people will disagree and say that you came out with the wrong answer, like the O.J. Simpson trial that a lot of people didn't think had the right verdict. So you always will be vulnerable to criticism when you set a cut score, but the important thing is that you decide in advance what the procedure should be and you follow them. So, like I said, there's no way to prove that you have a cut score that is right. A correct cut score given one set of values is wrong given a different set of values. So, and even if we agree that we're going to implement a certain method, I could think that we should do it one way and you could think we should do it another way, and neither of us is right or wrong depending on our justification. So the different techniques for setting a cut score will give different results, and this is known in the literature. Here are some quotes. The specific techniques employed in setting a standard may be a more powerful determinant of the standard than any other variable. And Michael Zeke, one of the biggest names in standard setting, says it's now generally accepted that different methods of setting cut scores will give different results. So you need to decide what method you're going to use based on the type of test that you're giving, the type of decision that you're making, the nature of the test, what kind of test questions you have. There are a lot of things that need to go into the decision of how to set a cut score. So if you are not an expert, you should get an expert to advise you on what the best way to set them would be. Now, there are the different types of methods. There is the Angoff method. Has anyone heard of the Angoff method before? Okay. William Angoff was at ETS, as a matter of fact. And it says here that it's used for multiple choice items, and the original method was limited to multiple choice items, but it can also be used on constructed response items as well. So there is a panel of experts that make a judgment, and the cut score results from that, and we'll go into that a little more. But what they do is take a test. Now, it's always important for the people that you have on your standard setting panel, you convene a group of experts, which for a educational test could be teachers that teach class 5 and know what students in class 5 can do. But it's always important to have them take the test to know what it is that's on the test. And what I usually do is I give them the test without the answers, and I imply that I'm going to look at how they do. Because I want them to be nervous. Because when you're an expert on a panel and you are then told that you're going to take the test and I'm going to judge you, they get more of a sense of what it's like to be a student. Because anyone who has a test with the answers thinks it's easy. But the minute, if you gave me a test on standard setting, I would be nervous because you're evaluating me. And therefore, I might make mistakes. I might get an answer wrong that I really thought was right. And that will humble me and remind me of what it's like to be someone taking a test. So I imply that if they say, oh, are you, they always laugh nervously and say, are you going to collect our papers? And I just say, just take the test. And then they take the test, and then I say, look, here's the answer key, look at how you did. And then I say, I'm not going to collect the answers, and then they all laugh in relief. But I think it's important for them to know, to remember what it's like to be a student and not have the answers in front of them. And then we need to have a discussion about what qualified means, or what it means to be in each of the performance levels. Because if I come from a very wealthy school district and I have students whose parents are very involved and parents who have the money for tutoring, I may have very high expectations of what a qualified student is. But if you come from a school district that doesn't have a lot of money, the parents are, there might be one parent and they're not educated themselves and they're always working and they don't have time for the students, you may have a lower expectation. Neither is right or wrong, but we need to come to an agreement on what is qualified and what is not qualified. So if I think a student is proficient if they can multiply a certain numbers with decimal places, and you think that they're proficient if they can add two numbers together, we have to come to an agreement, an agreement of what is good enough. So we need to come to a consensus on that before we make our ratings. So in the Angoff method, let's say we came to an agreement of what is a qualified person. And sometimes it's just easier to think of this like